Today we will be speaking about different ways in which we may conceptualize God, whether as being or as consciousness. And I would like to apologize in advance because probably we will have a lot of ambience noise. It's unavoidable, but it's such a beautiful, the river here, and so inspiring for the subject that we decided to do it here anyway. So let's delve into it. Maybe one of the interesting concepts that we have to deal with when we are trying to understand what we mean by the word God is if we understand it as someone or something with attributes which we can describe in a certain way or with which we can have a relationship in some manner, or if we understand God as the ineffable, something that we cannot really comprehend or even describe in any sense, because it doesn't have attributes, but most importantly, because it is not something. And these two possibilities, I would dare to say, after trying to understand different spiritual traditions, are two possibilities that life gives us to make sense of the infinity in a way that different people with different cognitive profiles may have a facility or a tendency to grasp. That is to say, for some of us, it's easier to understand the concept of God as consciousness, meaning by that something that we could not describe or we could not even show or indicate in any sense, because it is not something. So strictly speaking, probably it is something that we cannot even talk about. We can only affirm what it is not, but never what it is. On the other hand, there is this possibility of understanding God as someone or something with which or with whom we may have a relationship. It is a sort of dialogue. Probably for most people, this is the most easily apprehensible conception of God, one in which we are trying to develop a relationship, a sort of intimacy with God. This way of understanding infinity is, I would say, a way in which we try to depict what we cannot really grasp or understand in a way in which we can. That is to say, we try to help ourselves through some symbolic support with some attributes that we can understand by relating them with our own conception of ourselves and of the world, that can help us understand what we mean by God, and it can help us have an intimate experience of this of this sensation of being supported by this infinity that we may call Allah, God, Brahman, depending of the culture to which we belong. But it is very interesting because I would say in the most philosophical approaches, people think that the anthropomorphic conception of God as being, is probably a step. For some people, a step which is necessary to be able to grasp the ineffable, where words cannot reach. And it's interesting because it is as if devotion were a step towards the apprehension of infinity in a way which is direct and not mediated by devotion, by symbols, or by prayers. But on the other hand, from a more devotional perspective, for instance, the kind of devotion that we may find in Abrahamic traditions, or in the Vishnu tradition in Hinduism, or in the Sufi tradition within Abrahamic traditions, what we see is that God is understood as a being which manifests his or her presence in the world through his or her attributes. And it is through these attributes that we may reach its essence by praying to these attributes, or by concentrating our minds and our hearts in these attributes in a way that we are kind of transported to his or her essence through these manifestations. For instance, we could say that love, generosity, or being able to teach, or being able to show what is not true, or any sort of virtue might be understood as one of these attributes or characteristics of God. And if we try to emulate, if we try to turn our soul towards these attributes and live our lives in an effort to become some sort of manifestation of those attributes, then we may end up dissolving our sense of individuality and getting closer and closer to the essence of this unity out of which all these attributes manifest themselves as a world, as a cosmos. In this perspective, we could think that probably there are different possibilities according to different sorts of people or profiles, or one could say even profiles of seekers after truth, which may find their right path towards God. If you are more devotionally inclined, probably it is through the conception of God in a positive theological manner, as having attributes and as someone with whom I may have a dialogue and an intimate relationship in my heart. Maybe that is the way in which I can get closer to God. If I am more intellectually inclined, or I have kind of a more abstract mind, then probably understanding God in a negative theological manner as consciousness itself, and probably self-inquiry might be the method to lead us to that direct experience of God in its essence. So whether we understand God as a person, as a being, or we understand it as consciousness, we will probably fuse our own sense of individuality in this totality, in this oneness that transcends everything. And each person may find a path in some point in this continuum between understanding God in an anthropomorphic way or in a much more abstract way. The risk of making it too anthropomorphic is that we may develop a relationship that may be too human to be a really divine relationship. And the risk is, in the other case, if we understand God as consciousness, is that it may become so abstract that we cannot really experience it in our everyday life. The beauty of all this is that we have all these possibilities as different paths to experience the one within us. So far, we have been speaking about the relationship between understanding God as consciousness or God as being. A quite related subject is the one that has to do with the relationship between the unity and multiplicity, the relationship between the source and the manifestation. And in order to understand this, I think that there is a very good metaphor that we can use, which is trying to picture the way in which a spider's web is constructed. Think in the origin of the point, of the source from which everything will arise, from which everything will emanate, so to speak. This point, this origin of the spider's web, is the source, the unmanifested, from which everything else will manifest and appear, not as a construction, not as a creation, but as an emanation, which is kind of a Platonic concept, okay? So, out of this point, different threads of the spider's web, different radii arise. All these different radii can be understood as the different aspects of manifestations of the divine. So every radii is as if they were attributes, names of the divinity, names of God, or manifestations of his, her, or its attributes in a sort of cataphatic way, right? So from the beginning, from the source, from the point where they originate, they come out as gradual manifestations of some sort of archetypes or blueprints, and they will manifest themselves in different layers of ontological existence. It would be like, maybe a better way to state that would be to say ontological levels of reality. The closer these, let's say, concentric circles that connect the different threads in the spider web, these different concentric circles are like the different layers of reality, of manifestation, which go further and further away from oneness towards multiplicity. So we can say that each concentric layer is as if it were, or as if it represents a different ontological level of reality. The closest it is to the point, to the origin of the spider web, then the closer it is to oneness. So we could say that at the highest level, closer to the point, we may find these archetypes, these, so to speak, blueprints, from which the different aspects of reality will manifest in decreasing hierarchical layers of existence, until we have matter with all its multiplicity, with all its multifarious characteristics. So if we picture again the spider web, we may think about the point, the source, the unmanifested source, the origin of the threads, the different characteristics or manifestations of the divine, which are depicted or manifested in different layers, from the most subtle to the most gross or dense, in different layers of reality, represented, symbolized by the circles, by the degrading circles that connect the thread. So far, we have been speaking about the spider web as a metaphor to understanding the relationship between unity and multiplicity. It is very important to keep in mind that within this conception, which is a conception that Friedrich Schuon, in order to try to explain the metaphysics of Ibn Arabī in Sufism, has used. In this conception, there is no creation, but emanation. It is as if reality, the one, this point, unfolds itself in different layers of reality. So we can find different concentric circles, which are different ontological realities organized in a hierarchical way, in such a manner that the closest we go back to the circle, we are getting closer and closer to oneness. So we can move from beyond being to existence, understanding that each one of these layers is an increasing layer of multiplicity. Okay? But we have been speaking so far as if it were an emanation process, or, if I'm allowed to say, a constructive process. But this metaphor also allows us to understand which is the path that the different mystic traditions have suggested or have proposed as a path going back to oneness. And this is a path of deconstruction, a path of the opposite of unfolding, but of getting rid of different layers of what we think we are, of what we think the cosmos is, and in such a way that probably gradually we can experience in a direct manner this unity that underlies and is, one could say, the context of everything that we call myself and my experience and my world. So, as well as we understood the process as a divergent process, we can also understand it as a converging process, one in which we can gradually get rid of the different conceptual layers that construct this multifarious world that we call cosmos, in such a way that we may experience this unity as our own consciousness. So we have two possibilities. We may understand God mainly in terms of transcendence or in terms of immanence. In the first case, we see God as something beyond ourselves and something that we will eventually find or meet in a very distant future, probably in the afterlife. But we may also understand God as something immanent, something that is pervading the whole of cosmos and the whole of our everyday experience and experience even of ourselves. In some traditions, there is a tendency to understand God in either one or the other way. I invite you to explore the possibility that maybe these are just different ways in which our finite mind is trying to make sense of something that we cannot really apprehend. And so probably sometimes we may relate to God as something that goes much beyond ourselves and that can really help us soothe our heart. But at other moments, maybe we can experience the presence of God in everything around us, like here in this wonderful river. So it's very important to follow in a very authentic and I would say open way, the way in which we experience God in a moment-by-moment manner, without being trapped in any conceptualizations. Concepts are very important because they serve as pointers that guide us, guide our experience. They show to us where we have to focus our attention when we are trying to make sense of life. But they're not life itself, they're not God itself. So it's very important to know all these conceptualizations, to have some sort of conceptual knowledge, but only, I would dare to say, to drop it off in such a way that we open ourselves to experience God, sometimes in a very intimate way, in a dialogue in our heart, and at other times just in the presence of nature, as something that is immanent to our everyday experience.